And you may know actually this poem, which is one of his most famous. It's quite a long poem called In Memoriam. And the one that we'll be looking at is the Prelude. So it's the first poem in this long series of poems. All of the poems in this larger work, In Memoriam, are in these 4-line stanzas, just like you see here. But there's no regular number of stanzas per poem. So some of them are like 3 stanzas, and some of them are 12 stanzas, but all of them are in these 4-line stanzas. So last week I mentioned that we were starting with a poet whom I considered extremely pious in a very traditional way. That was Gerard Manley Hopkins, and he was writing around the 1870s. Tennyson's just a bit earlier. In Memoriam was published in 1850, but still in the Victorian age, also in England. And Tennyson, I think, at least as you'll see in this poem, has a slightly more complicated relationship with faith, and the reason for that is actually provided for us in the poem. So I think in this case, as much as I like to read the poems in isolation, and we'll be able to talk about it as a sort of standalone entity, I think you also have to know a little bit about In Memoriam to understand what he's writing. And to me, this isn't about reading biography onto the poetry, but about what Tennyson has actually set up for us, because he calls the poem In Memoriam, which is pretty suggestive already, and he calls it In Memoriam AHH, right? And so then we have to say, wait a minute, something's going on here that sets up the context for us. Does anyone know?
Yeah, that was a very close friend of his.
Exactly, Alfred Henry Hallam,
yes.
Who was his college roommate, his best friend, and also the fiancé of Tennyson's sister. So Tennyson introduced his college roommate to his sister, and they were engaged to be married. So close on a number of levels, right?
Yes.
And Hallam actually drowned. He died at sea. And the whole poem, the whole series, is a kind of poetic obituary, a remembrance of Hallam. So I think one of the ways already, before we even read the poem, that we can see... Hi, Claude. We're up to page 3 here. Do you want to share, or do you want your own copies?
Good.
Okay. So one of the ways that we can already see the difference here is that when we think about Gerard Manley Hopkins, and for those of you who weren't here, we were reading about Hopkins, we were reading Pied Beauty, where he's just looking out at the world around him and finding all of this beauty in the world. Here, we're dealing with someone who's actually suffered a loss, and we know that suffering a loss makes you think about faith in different ways than just looking at nature does, right? Now, it doesn't mean it has to shake your faith. Some people go the other way, right? The loss makes them feel more deeply faithful. But we know that it does, in some way, often affect the way people think about God and God's relationship to the world. So it's one thing to walk outside and say, wow, it's really beautiful, I'm going to write a poem about that, and a really different thing to lose your best friend very young and say, I'm going to write a poem about that. So I think already we're set up with a kind of situation where we're going to see Tennyson grappling with something quite different from what Hopkins is grappling with, and that's understandable. They're facing different moments in their lives. Okay, so let's read this. You'll notice that it goes on to the next page. I was trying to find some way to get it all on one page, but I couldn't do it, so we'll just go on to the next page. And this is the prelude to In Memoriam. Of course, also, I should mention before I read that Tennyson is a Christian poet, so you'll see some, I think, Christian references here that feel like they're overtly Christian, but when we talk about the theology of the poem, in some ways we can probably step back from that, and one thing we may want to discuss is how much we feel that the specific religion is necessary to the understanding about the theology, and how much of the theology may be applicable across religious traditions and across faiths. It's not a question that has a clear answer, but it's one that's worth exploring a bit. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove. Thine are these orbs of light and shade, thou madest life in man and brute, thou madest death, and lo, thy foot is on the skull which thou hast made. Thou wilt not leave us in the dust, thou madest man, he knows not why. He thinks he was not made to die, and thou hast made him, thou art just. Thou seemest human and divine, the highest, holiest manhood thou Our wills are ours, we know not how. Our wills are ours to make them thine. Our little systems have their day, they have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. We have but faith, we cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see, and yet we trust it comes from thee, a beam in darkness. Let it grow. Let knowledge grow from more to more, but more of reverence in us dwell, that mind and soul, according well, may make one music as before, but vaster. We are fools and slight. We mock thee when we do not fear, but help thy foolish ones to bear. Help thy vain worlds to bear thy light. Forgive what seemed my sin in me, what seemed my worth since I began, for merit lives from man to man, and not from man, O Lord, to thee. Forgive my grief for one removed, thy creature, whom I found so fair. I trust he lives in thee, and there I find him worthier to be loved. Forgive these wild and wandering cries, confusions of a wasted youth. Forgive them where they fail in truth, and in thy wisdom make me wise. Tennyson is a pretty spectacular poet and wordsmith, and you can see a lot of places, I think, where he crafts the language very, very beautifully. It has a music to it, as Hopkins does, but a different sort of music. He uses rhyme extremely well, wordplay, all of these things I think we can appreciate in the poem, and we can talk about any of them, but I think first we should get the meaning, the surface meaning of Chat, of sort of what is actually being said here. Sometimes that's hard because of just the Victorian language, but we can talk through the sort of stages of the poem just to make sure we all are on the same page in terms of what it actually is literally saying. Okay, so one of the places, obviously, that you see the Christian image invoked is in the first line, strong Son of God, immortal love. That's a very Christian conception of God, right? Obviously, Son of God is, but also immortal love as a way to conceive of God. But really that first stanza is about belief, about faith, right? We have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone embrace, believing what we cannot prove. And you see that idea come back again and again through the poem. Did you notice it? Right? We believe, we want to believe, and yet our belief is predicated on something other than vision, other than knowledge, right? Those are worldly things, and we believe based on something else, right? Faith and faith alone, he says. And then into lots of power about God, right? Here, God has created life, God has created death, God's foot stands on the skull. It's an image that you can picture, but also one you're probably familiar with from, say, Hamlet, right? But other places too, of course. Anything that you know about Renaissance painting, there's lots of imagery of skulls as a kind of show of God's power and of God's triumph over life, and that men, in this case, obviously he says men to mean humans, are not in charge of those decisions. Those are relegated to another being, to a different power. And again, on man's lack of knowledge. Thou madest man, he knows not why. He thinks he was not made to die. And what do you think that line is saying? Because that's something about human nature.
Well, we all think we're going to live forever.
Right, that sense of immortality. And here from a young man in particular who lost a young friend thinking, this wasn't in the plans for us. This isn't what we thought we had. But he's been reminded of it here. And yet then each time it feels almost a little bit accusing, just the hint that he steps back from that. And thou hast made him, thou art just, right? And so it's like, you feel, I think, that slight tug between anger maybe, or frustration, or this isn't how it was supposed to be, but I know, God, that you're in charge, you're just, you're making the right decisions. And I think that you see as the poem goes on, that there's this kind of back and forth within himself of that belief, and also that, I mean, maybe it's just sadness. We can talk about what you think that emotion might be, that feeling. What's our little systems have their day? What are our little systems?
Bodies.
Yeah, our bodies, exactly. And that actually is taking a line from John Donne. Remember John Donne from last time? So he talks about us as little worlds or little systems. He actually has a sonnet in the Holy Sonnets, the one of which we read last time, where he says, I am a little world made cunningly, and talks about his body as a system. And so Tennyson is sort of drawing on that image. They have their day and cease to be. That is, they live and then they go away. And God doesn't, right? And then we have faith we cannot know, because knowledge is things that we see, and yet we trust it comes from thee. So that sixth stanza seems to echo something that we read already in the first stanza. Why would a poet say it again? Any sense of why he might? I mean, if he already said in the first stanza, why say it again in the sixth? We trust it comes from thee.
I don't think he's convinced.
Okay, good. Right. So that might remind us a little bit of Death Be Not Proud, right? Once you've said something a lot of times, then your reader starts to think, do you really mean that? Right? So it may be that he's trying to convince himself, and saying it again is a way to do that. It may also be a poetic device, right? He just had another lovely way to say it, and so he wanted to try again. But also, the first stanza just ends believing where we cannot prove, which is just a statement. This is what faith is. We believe when we can't prove. But the sixth stanza goes a little bit farther. You are a beam in the darkness, let it grow, which isn't just a statement of fact. It's what?
It's a hope to grow in faith.
That's right. It's almost
After
a
this
prayer.
challenge.
Exactly. So it's not just an observation. It's making the observation again and then pushing the observation onto a wish. Exactly, or a hope. Yeah. I hope that I'll continue to grow in this kind of belief, in this faith. And then he goes back to knowledge. Let knowledge grow from more to more, but more of reverence in us dwell. So even as we gain in knowledge, not to become arrogance, but to become reverence. The more we know, the more we should revere God. Okay? And when that happens, then mind and soul according well. Now this is an older use of according, but what do we mean by according here?
Together.
Going together, exactly. Like to work in accord,
Harmony.
right? In harmony, exactly. May make one music as before. So what's the mind in this analogy? The mind has a connection to which part of this? To the knowledge, reason, right? Logic, exactly. And what is the soul? Faith, belief, exactly. And if I can bring my knowledge into accord with my faith, then I can make one music as before. Where's that little as before getting stuck in there?
Right.
As before what? As before the death. Exactly. It's two tiny little words that feel like they're maybe stuck on the end of that stanza for the rhyme, but it really changes the meaning too. You see that something has changed in him. Once my mind and my soul were in accord. Right now, not so much. But that's what I'm praying for. I'm wishing for that feeling to come back, that the knowledge I have of what I see around me accords with my sense of belief. I think it's a really beautiful thing to ask for in the face of a loss. To say, I once had that sensibility, and why in our youth do we have that sense that what we see and what we believe fit together perfectly?
I think that's before things happen in your life.
That's exactly right. When we're young and we haven't experienced
Right.
pain or loss or tragedy,
Sort of-
it's not as hard.
It's being naive.
There's a kind of naivete about it, right? It's not as hard to say, sure, the world is great, sure, God is great, I'll look around, everything's perfect, right? Not that kids, as I've experienced, don't feel that their lives are hard in various ways, right? But this feels to us like a kind of existential crisis of faith, as opposed to like, I had a bad day or my favorite TV show got canceled or whatever. And I mean, God willing that all kids should have lives like that. We know that that's not true, right? There are children who don't have that, the beauty of that naivete. There are children who live with this kind of thing already. But in our community, generally, not always, but generally, you're allowed naivete up to a certain age when the real world sort of strikes with some pain. Right? Tennyson is at that moment, right? And so he's saying, I want that back, that feeling. But he doesn't say it's just as naivete, because he's not going to get his friend back. But he wants to feel again that the knowledge and the faith have both a place in him. The mind and the soul can work together. And then he even goes farther, and this is a great overlap from one stanza to the next. I love it. May make one music as before. He could totally just put a period there, right? But then he doesn't. He puts a comma instead, and the next line is, but faster, right? So it's not just that he wants them to fit together but as they did before, but they have to be even bigger. That accord has to be even bigger. Why?
So overcame the challenge.
Yeah, because it has to accommodate this new knowledge, right? This new fact of his life. That's not going to go away, and so that larger sense has to be even bigger than it was before something bad had happened. Great, yeah. Then he goes back to putting down humans. We are fools and slight. We mock thee when we do not fear. Does that sound like something that you can understand as a kind of,
absolutely.
yeah?
It's so easy.
Right.
And it's usually tested in situations like this.
Right, good. And I think it's something that we understand too. I mean, certainly our faith and our prayers talk about fear of God frequently as an emotion that we should feel. Not exclusively fear, but to live in fear of God is to recognize God's power over us and the vastness. And here he says, if we don't have that fear, then we mock, right? And so he's actually saying that the fear is necessary in order to have the right kind of piety. But help thy foolish ones to bear, help thy vain worlds to bear thy light. And remember we were saying the system, like we're the worlds. So if we're these vain worlds, each of us, then again, it's a prayer to God, right? Let us rise to the occasion that you're entrusting us with, okay? And then the last three stanzas, the ones on the next page, all start with forgive, okay? So do you see the trajectory of the poem? A lot of statements first, and then moving gradually into prayer. And then what's the last part when it says forgive? I mean, the prayer, I guess I'm saying, is like a hope, a wish for the self. And then what's the forgive part?
Direct response to God.
Yeah, okay.
He's asking for God's forgiveness. This is direct.
Right, so it's a kind of petition, right? An apology and a petition. And what are the three things that he's asking forgiveness for?
Lack of faith in the face of the grief.
Okay, good, absolutely. And that's mostly the second one. So if we look at the first one, forgive what seemed my sin in me, what seemed my worth since I began. For merit lives from man to man, and not from man, O Lord, to thee. I think this is actually the hardest stanza of the whole poem.
It's a sort of vanity, like man's
A kind of vanity,
human
absolutely.
vanity,
Yes.
thinking more of yourself.
What seemed my worth in me, right? But it does say, it doesn't say, I believed that merit lived from man to man and not from man, O Lord, to thee, but it does seem to imply that, right? That I saw in Hallam, right, in this friend, the value, and I didn't see that he was just a conduit for the value from you, right? So yeah, it's a kind of arrogance. And then the second of the forgive, I think, is exactly what you're saying. Forgive my grief for one removed, thy creature whom I found so fair. Right? I trust he lives in thee, and there I find him worthier to be loved. So why does he need to be forgiven for having found Hallam? Fair means beautiful, but of course we mean like as a beautiful person, right? Like the sort of, he had a beautiful soul. I don't think it means physically beautiful, even though we use fair that way sometimes. Why does he need to be forgiven for that?
He thought he was the end of the world.
Yeah?
And here, now that he's gone and is in the realm of God, there's even more to him.
That's right. Does that feel honest to you? Do you think that that's what Tennyson really is feeling? The answer can be yes. I know I'm saying it like it shouldn't be, but what do you think?
It's not my philosophy.
Yeah. I think it's a hard philosophy to hold on to when you miss somebody, right? I mean, maybe there's a level on which you could believe that, but you still want the person there with you. Or, yes, go to God, but maybe when you're older, not in your early 20s. That's too young. But I think that reminder, it's thy creature, right? Every one of us is actually a possession of God. We're here by God's grace. And so that reminder, thy creature, not my creature, right? Yours. And so now that he's with you, I find him worthier to be loved. Okay? And then
Is this a reference to, I find him worthier to be loved? Is this a reference to his friend becoming an angel, some kind of Christian illusion?
It's a Christian illusion about the afterlife. I don't know that it has to be specifically angelic, but the idea that the soul dwells in heaven now makes him worthier to be loved because he's part of that sort of now heavenly choir of souls. I don't know that we have to go all the way to angel, but it's certainly a possibility.
He's part of the heavenly
Yes,
choir.
exactly. Yes.
Is he saying that grief is not appropriate because when you die you go to heaven and you're with God, and therefore you have no reason to be. He's in a better place.
That's right, he is. And so when he says, I trust he lives in thee, it's back to that idea of faith, and therefore I shouldn't be grieving. And in fact, the fact that I am grieving means I should apologize to God, because it means I'm not totally buying into the system here, which I should be, right? So he feels that he has to apologize for his grief, because grief, according to this worldview, is actually the wrong response. It's a response that demonstrates an insufficient faith. Right? If you have sufficient faith, then you wouldn't be grieving. But I think it's more complicated than that. And I know it feels subtle, but I think that he is not saying, so I'm not going to grieve anymore. Right? The grief is still real and there, and it's very human. Yeah, go ahead.
He doesn't have access to this friend.
Right.
Then it's pure love, because it's love at such a great distance, and you can only access it if you believe you can't access it.
Yes, absolutely. That's absolutely right. But he's grieving for that human contact. But he also recognizes that maybe he shouldn't be. Right? But I don't know how, is he being way too hard on himself? I think it's a little bit of a mild rebuke to himself, right? And also a way to try to comfort himself. And I see a lot of self-comfort all the way through this poem. It's a way of saying, I shouldn't be this sad because there's an upside. Right? But he's still sad. Right? And then finally, forgive these wild and wandering cries. So what's the last forgiveness for? The writing the poem. Yeah, for this poem. Right? And I think there we also have to question it a little bit. Because like if the poem ended here, okay, fine. But it's like 70 pages after this of poem. Right? So this is the prelude for a reason. There's 70 pages of poem after this, in which he continues to lament the loss of Hallam. And it's gorgeous stuff, but it's hard to say I'm completely repenting for my, crazy poetry. I'm just going to do it for like 1 year more, right?
So he's actually asking forgiveness in the future, because he's going to continue to wander and cry.
Yes, exactly. Okay, now there's also historically, I think there's some belief that this prelude was written at the end of writing the poem, and then he just put it at the beginning, in which case the apology means something a little different than if he wrote the apology first and then wrote all the rest of the poem. But that's a sort of textual history. Yeah.
I mean, the prelude follows a convention of invoking the muse.
That's right.
In this case, the muse is God, which I don't know. I mean, Milton did that. I don't know if anyone else really has.
Interesting, right. So usually when we see the muse invoked, which is what happens in preludes, it's like how Philip Sidney did it, which is actually speaking to the muses, as in like the Greek muses, right? Which is not a Christian faith, but then Tennyson takes that same principle and just speaks to God. I can't think off the top of my head who else did, but I'm sure others did. I would just have to think about who invoked God in that way. Right, and often there is also in the prelude a sense of apology. Like if I did something wrong here, it's not the muse's fault. That's all on me. So here he's apologizing to God for writing the poem in a way that's wild and wandering, right? Confusions of a wasted youth. And so you see there also that he's feeling like he's confused and that he has to rethink what his whole youth has been, that he felt that he had seen clearly. And then one more forgive. Forgive them, which is the confusions, the cries, where they fail in truth, right? Where I haven't been sufficiently truthful. And then the last request from God, in thy wisdom, make me wise, which, that line just kills me. That's probably not the right phrase to use here, but I just find it so beautiful that to say, in thy wisdom, make me wise, give me a tiny portion of that insight, of that worldview that you, God, have, so that I can understand even a little bit more and not feel that I'm engaging in wild and wandering cries or that I'm engaging in a grief that I shouldn't actually have. Okay, reactions to this one? What do you think? Yeah.
I think he's talking about the sins he committed to the dead person. Because once somebody is gone, you can't apologize. Right. You can't fix it.
True.
It's done already.
Right.
And I think that's what he's talking about. Is what seeing my sin in me is that when I acted badly towards him.
Oh, a sin to him. Interesting. Because I think when he says what seemed my sin in me, what seemed my worth since I began, was thinking too highly of himself. And maybe back to that point about thinking you can live forever, right? That he felt that he had a kind of godliness in him that he now sees is actually only in the realm of God. That's not to say he's not also maybe thinking about something he did with Hallam, but this feels like a very existential kind of apology, right? About his own sense of self that's now been utterly shaped by this new reality. Any other thoughts on the poem?
He seems to be searching around to find reasons to accept this thing that he cannot accept.
Agreed, absolutely. He's working pretty hard at it, right? Do you think it's working?
He's just very ambivalent, even at the end here, and I don't know when that's going to work itself out.
Right.
And he's upset that he's ambivalent. And
One of the reasons that I love poems like this is that it just feels very human and true to me. And I think even though he's a Christian poet and he uses language that I would never use for myself, the emotion at the root of it is an emotion I totally understand, right? That ambivalence, that wish for greater piety and for more faith, and the recognition at the same time that you just don't totally feel it the way that I should say I instead of you, the way that I want to feel it all the time, right? Especially in the face of a challenge, right? It's hard to feel that faith. And I think that there's something really powerful for those of us who are within the Jewish tradition to see that people in other traditions feel that the same way, because a lot of times we set up our traditions as clashing in every possible way, right? And here there's language that clashes with my understanding of God, but the emotion doesn't clash at all. And so I like that sense of connection across faiths, because all of us are trying on some level to answer the same difficult questions, right? And responding with the same difficult responses that I think here show a lot of ambivalence.
yes, it's a universal feeling.
Right, exactly, yeah.
It cuts across.
Right, so I don't want to overstate the universality, because there are clearly differences. But there are similarities that are worth our noting also, because they can enhance our own experience of just thinking about how we interact with the world.
Yeah, like I said, I think it came from Rabbi Rosenberg's last session.
Okay.
If God did not exist, man would have a need to create him. And that speaks to the universal need for greater understanding. And that's, I think, is the universal principle.
Very nice, absolutely, yeah. So I think that we can see that sense in this poem, and then I think what we should do is move on to the next poem, which comes from a very specifically Jewish tradition, sort of see, it's not in response to a specific loss in the same way that in Memoriam is, but it's a poem called Kaddish by Charles Resnick, who's one of the most important, I would say, Jewish poets of the 20th century. Very difficult, often complex philosophical work. I don't know if anyone here lives in Riverdale and is familiar with the Yeshiva Chovevei Torah, but Rabbi Chagai Resnick, who's in charge of the Talmud program there, I think is his nephew. So we have a little bit of a Riverdale connection to Charles Resnick, who lived in California actually, but that's where Chagai is from. So I don't know how much he knows about the poetry, but he probably has access to some really great manuscripts. So this is Resnick writing a poem that he calls Kaddish. You're going to recognize lots of this, but as we're thinking about ideas of universality, it's worth then looking at something from a tradition that's much more familiar and closer to us, sort of seeing how he plays with similar ideas about loss and about petition to God in the face of loss. So why don't we look at Kaddish? Yes, sure.
Could you give us a little bit of a background on Charles Resnick? I'm not familiar with him.
I actually can't off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I'd have to look up more about him. I can't tell you too much about his life. I believe he was born in Europe and came to America because of the Holocaust, but I would want to double check on the dates and the details of that before I say.
Does it come from the world of academia or the revenue? I know you don't want us to take that particularly with us.
Yes.
But it's interesting. And he's still alive?
No.
Okay, so when was this written?
This is, did you just look it up? This was written, I think, in the either 1950s or early 60s.
You could look at that by Wikipedia, but I would prefer not to.
So one can assume that the Jewish history of the 20th century had an impact.
Oh, no question. Absolutely, absolutely. And he has a number of poems about the Holocaust explicitly, for sure.
It's just an interesting concept.
Yes, absolutely.
I think he also grew up in Brooklyn, I thought.
Oh, before he went to California?
And that he had a lot of difficulty, prejudice against him when he went to school.
Okay.
He suffered greatly from that. I think his other poems reflect that he writes.
Some of them, yes, and he does write about his childhood, but he also writes a lot of things about sort of philosophical theology. He has this very philosophical outlook, too. Okay, so let's look at Kaddish, and then if you want more biography later, I can provide more. Okay. So this little the first paragraph that we have here is actually just a translation, so that he's setting up for people who may not come from within the tradition, who aren't familiar with the Rabbi's Kaddish, what he's working with as a theme. So we may not need this, but I'll read it because he does publish it as part of the poem. Upon Israel and upon the rabbis and upon their disciples and upon all the disciples of their disciples and upon all who engage in the study of the Torah in this place and in every place, unto them and unto you be abundant peace, grace, loving kindness, mercy, long life, ample sustenance and salvation from their Father who is in heaven, and say ye Amen. Kaddish D'Rabbanan, translated by Rabbi Travers Herford. Upon Israel and upon the rabbis and upon the disciples and upon all the disciples of their disciples and upon all who study the Torah in this place and in every place, to them and to you, peace. Upon Israel and upon all who meet with unfriendly glances, sticks and stones and names on posters, in newspapers or in books to last, chalked on asphalt or in acid on glass, shouted from 1,000 windows by radio, who are pushed out of classrooms and rushing trains, whom the 100 hands of a mob strike, and whom jailers strike with bunches of keys, with revolver butts. To them and to you, in this place and in every place, safety. Upon Israel and upon all who live as the sparrows of the streets under the cornices of the houses of others, and as rabbits in the fields of strangers on the grace of the seasons, and what the gleaners leave in the corners, you children of the wind, birds that feed on the tree of knowledge, in this place and in every place, to them, and a straight translation with essentially a poetic lineation of just the straight translation, right? You see that? So he just works with the original text first. But he changes it slightly, and he just has to them and to you, peace, instead of that whole line. Peace, grace, loving kindness, mercy, long life, ample sustenance. But then he plays with each of those. So what are the images that we see invoked here? And what are some larger takeaways that we could find from his reimagining, I would say, of the Kaddish D'Rabbanan? I could tell you, but it's more interesting for you to get to talk a little bit.
The paragraph that ends in safety is like completely a description of any kind of abuse. It screams Holocaust, but it screams any period of Jewish suffering.
That's right. So I think that he's likely from his own period in time invoking the Holocaust there, but it's not so specific that it couldn't also be about other kinds of moments, right, in which the Jews have been persecuted. Yeah?
Not just Jewish suffering. I mean, it says, on all who meet, and also the stanza following, all who live. The last stanza seems to be the one that specifically...
Right. So each one starts with upon Israel.
Right.
So each one includes Jews and then expands, the two middle in particular, upon Israel and upon all. Right? So that's the particularist and the universal. And then he does it again, the particularist and the universal. And the last one is just upon Israel. Right? And the first one too, frankly, right? Because that's the actual translation, upon Israel and upon the rabbis. So clearly all of them are speaking about the Jews, about Israel. He could have left out upon Israel. He could have just started with upon all who meet with unfriendly glances, which really universalizes the poem in a much different way. Anyone who's persecuted. Here it's Jews and others who are persecuted. Jews and others who live as the sparrows in the streets, right? And then finally just upon Israel. Right? And what we find then is that we can compare how each one progresses and how each one ends. Peace, safety, a living, which is parallel to the sustenance from the Kaddish D'Rabbanan, and then finally just life. Right? Okay, so good observations there.
It's like a blessing. It really is.
Which the Kaddish is.
Right? Which
We're
is,
kind of, yeah.
Right. And despite all of these horrors of life, we want to bless you. We want you to feel that the safety, the peace, all comes from God. And I think that that's, and say Amen. He wants you to say, and life itself is good.
Mm.
If you blot out all of these negative things, then upon each of us who lives, it is good.
Interesting. I don't know if I see it quite as positive as that, although that's lovely. I'm glad that you're getting something so nice out of it. I guess I would go back to that word we used for the Tennyson poem, ambivalence. Do you see it at all? Or it's just beautiful and positive? Because, if you just blot out all the stuff in the middle, it's kind of a tough thing to do. It's hard to just blot out all the stuff in the middle, right?
But it's despite.
Where does
all
it say
of that.
despite, though? Where do you see that? It's
I
a
think
wish for that.
It's a wish for that.
Right.
And upon all who meet with unfriendly glances, well, all of us have met with
Right.
unfriendly
Sure.
glances at some point, and all of us have been shouted at. And to all of these, I wish you safety.
Right.
So-
Right, that I'm with you
Okay.
on. I'm with you
Okay,
on the I
good.
wish you safety. Right? And then it's just life is good, that's where I lost you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I would maybe, to me, I see it very differently. I would
Okay,
say
good.
not despite, but because of.
Ah.
Because here's why we need to ask for these things.
Mhm.
And here's why it ranges from the slight to the life-threatening
Right.
in these different arenas.
Right.
And that's why we need to ask for this. It's one
Right.
thing if your life is great, you're walking down the street, you're not really actively saying, Hashem, please, make it safe for me, please, I need something to eat. No, because you're just having your life. This is all the because.
Right. So this poem, like the last one, in the way that you're pointing out, is in response to something negative, and it changes the faith in response to the negative.
And it's interesting because speaking of faith, God's not mentioned.
Nice.
So God's not mentioned at all, and in fact.
Nor is God mentioned in the Kaddish, which,
And-
right?
and what I find kind of interesting
Yeah.
is God's not mentioned, and as a matter of fact, look at all these bad things that are happening.
Yeah.
Wow, all these bad things are happening, and yet we are asking for, we're not even asking for it specifically from God. We're just asking for this, and we need to ask for this.
Right.
And where does this bad stuff come from? Where is this rescue supposed to be coming from?
Excellent.
It just raises so many things.
It does. It raises so many questions. Where is the bad stuff coming from, right? It's not wishing for safety on the jailers, only on those whom the jailers have struck. So, if it's just everything's good, where did all of this come from? But I think the same question that you're asking, but where is the salvation from it going to come
Yeah,
from?
where's that gonna come from?
Right. It does feel like there's almost a noun missing in each of the stanzas, right? It starts with upon and the thing that it's asking for, but it's not ever clear exactly to whom that's being addressed. But the thing that's interesting about that for me is that structure is true of the Kaddish itself, which is an interesting thing to then have to reflect back to that tefillah on. Yeah.
Well, to me, what struck me was that actually he left out the end of the Kaddish part that's
That's right.
translated
That's right.
from their Father who is in heaven. So I think in a way it's a wish, but I think he kept God almost
More
markedly
of it.
absent.
Good. Excellent,
Do you know what
yes.
I'm saying?
So, right, when he includes
It's
this
like a human
translation.
wish. To me, it seems more like a human
Nice.
wish than he's wishing from like a higher being.
Like,
Like
so
he's
when
not
you say
calling on a higher.
So when you
being.
say human wish, you don't mean from a human, you mean to humans
Right,
also.
like
Nice.
he's wishing
Okay, good.
for,
Good.
but not calling on a higher being to provide that.
Interesting, because he leaves out that last bit of the,
Exactly.
right, that's a great point. And when he includes the translation and then has his rewriting that clearly leaves something out of the translation, it draws attention to
Right,
that.
like it ends at
Great point.
peace, which
Yep.
is right before.
Good, great point, yeah.
At the beginning, first 3 paragraphs, it's directed towards Israel, the Jewish people. But then starting upon Israel, upon all who live as the sparrows in the streets,
Yeah.
he's widening it to the rest of the world and becomes more universal.
Right, so he was pointing that out, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Bob was pointing that out, that even the paragraph before that, because it's upon Israel and upon all who meet with unfriendly glances. So you're right that it moves to a more universal. I think it does it 1 paragraph even earlier than the one you cited. But yes, it's including the Jewish people and others who suffer in these ways. Absolutely, yeah.
Just the discussion now is making me think of the Psalms. This is very
Interesting.
similar to that.
Where do you see?
Just the tone. I mean,
Oh.
God. We are tortured. We have enemies. We are.
Right.
But where is our salvation? Where are you?
Yeah, good.
And that has a universal. Well, I mean,
Sure,
it's
yes.
used, by Christians and
Right.
Jews, and their.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
well, sure, I mean, the Tehillim are drawn on by
But
Bible
yeah,
traditions, sure. Do you think this is a poem that could speak to people outside of the Jewish tradition? The way that I was just saying the Tennyson poem could?
Well, what intrigues me most is the 3rd stanza.
Okay.
It's so expansive. It's talking about animals and strangers. It's talking about children of men, I don't know what that is,
Yeah.
but also that feet on the tree of knowledge.
Yeah.
Now,
It's an interesting
that's-
little mention, right?
That's a very intriguing line,
Right.
and that refers back to the Tennyson poem in a way, where he had faith and knowledge that are sort of balancing one another.
Right.
And I'm not sure what to then and to you living. I don't know what that means exactly. You have peace, safety, life
Right.
at the end of the stanzas.
Yeah.
Again, the whole structure and the whole substance of that.
Right. That one's
paragraph
confusing
is
too, yeah.
Very, very.
Well, it's very metaphorical. I would say, just to answer that, I think that a living is being used in two different ways. When we say, how do you make a living, it just means something. It means sustenance. And so I think that he is drawing on that idea, but also preparing us for the last line, life. Because when you talk about a living, there are other ways that he could have wished for that there that wouldn't have the double meaning of life as the root of the word.
It's very
Right.
ambiguous
Yeah,
and
it is.
vague, and it can also be, as you say, expanded on in so
Right.
many different ways.
Right.
So that's.
But I do think there's also some sense of the Jews in particular, in as a post-Holocaust poem, having to hide, under the cornices of the houses of others, right? That's about having to hide, gleaning from the fields what was left, right? Okay, that's a reference to root, obviously, but also to people who are having to sneak around and try to find food wherever they can find it. Right? So it's written in this very metaphorical way, but I think it's meant to invoke for us images of people actually sort of sneaking around under the cover of night or through the grace of strangers to try to even live another day, right? Which feels to me very like a Holocaust image, even though he's saying, and to anyone in this situation, so to make it more expansive. Yeah.
I was thinking, I went to look at Maslow's hierarchy. It doesn't match perfectly. But if you think about peace and safety and living being sustenance,
right.
You can't even be free to live a life until you have those three
things.
Basic needs
Mm-hmm.
met.
Good.
And I think he does do things to draw everybody into that ultimate, but even the birds in the tree of knowledge, part of life is to be a thinking, living, interacting human being. And I think that doesn't come until the other. It's hard to have those things in the absence of the first three.
Right, very nice. That's a great point. So that it's leading up to life as the culminating thing, but you can't have life if you're being attacked. Also, of course, we have to say tree of knowledge is also an allusion to Gan Eden, right? I mean, we don't want to overlook that part too. It's not just knowledge in Tennyson's sense, but also, knowledge of good and evil, which is implied but not said outright, but we're supposed to get that from it.
Yeah, I think he's really bargaining with God. The first one, he's asking for abundant peace, grace, loving his kindness, a wonderful life.
Well, that one's just the translation.
Don't give
but
me that, at least give me peace.
Right.
And
Oh, I
if I
see.
can't get peace, give me safety.
Oh,
And
that
if
each
I
one's
can't
moving
get
downwards.
safety,
That's the opposite
at
of your
least
thing.
the living.
Nice.
And then finally, at least life, let me live. You see, so
I love that because you're two, they're opposite in a way, and yet they kind of work together to see the hierarchy. That's great. I love that. That's a great reading. Thank you. Yeah.
When you were talking about non-Jews relating to this, when we were reading this, there's a poem, a song. The exact title I don't know, but it's "I Wish You," and the single lists all the things that he wishes his beloved one. But in the end, I wish you love, which is such an American value. Such a, this is, the gestalt. Never mind, I wish you love.
Right.
So very different from this.
Yes. Well, it's a different set of concerns too, right?
Right.
That also has so much to do with the experience of the speaker.
Yeah.
What's the standard for what we should be wishing for one another? We see something very different from the kind of experience that this person's describing than from something like that where love is like the highest thing you can possibly think of. I mean, it suggests someone who hasn't maybe suffered so much also, right? If that's the most that you can think of. But maybe that's a good thing, right? Maybe that suggests that we're in such a different place that it's hard to even imagine peace as the highest thing you could wish for. God willing, it should stay that way. Yeah.
To me, the first part of the poem has a lot of challenges and overcoming anti-Semitism and oppression, and the last paragraph, the last stanza, is very optimistic because to me it seems that the fact that you'll have children and children's children and so many generations, that the Jewish people is eternal in some sort of mysterious way despite all of these challenges. And that life continues. To me, that's the optimistic
part
Right.
of it.
I agree that the end is the most optimistic, although there is still, I think, a little bit of a conditional there, right? If they have children and their children and their children, then we wish them life. But it's a hope for that, not a guarantee. But definitely I see that sort of positive note creep in at the end. And that's the only stanza also, sorry, I should tell you the terminology here. When they're irregular length like this, they're called verse paragraphs rather than stanzas. So we'll go paragraph rather than stanza. It's tempting to just say stanza when you think of poem, but stanzas are actually regular in length, like in the Tennyson poem. So that last verse paragraph is the place where there's no violence mentioned, right? And there's just a possibility of living a life. Yeah, good. One or two more comments on this, and then we're going to move on to the next one.
I did want to point out one thing. And
Sure.
And it may, for me, it may tie in with why God is not specific in this poem.
Good.
Because the challenges, the hardships, the bad things, they're all at the hand of other humans. So.
And there are other humans mentioned here.
Yes.
We're doing
yes.
those
So,
things. That's
so
right.
it's not like, there's illness. It's not like there's illness, there's.
It's not natural
flood,
disaster,
there's
yeah.
no natural
That's right.
disasters whatsoever.
Right, good.
Everything can be traced back to treatment by other human beings. And maybe that is a reason why God is not more specifically in this poem in terms of asking for something.
Great.
Because
That's
if
a great
they would
point,
just
yeah.
stop, then
Yeah.
we'd be okay, right? So
That's
maybe
right.
they should just stop.
Yeah, very nice. It's an excellent point that we're not talking here about, or even like in the Tennyson poem, freak accident, right?
Accident,
That wasn't someone doing something mean to someone else. Someone died, but it feels almost like it was coming from God because it was such a random occurrence. This is human beings enacting evil on each other. Good. Yeah. Last comment on this one?
Who is he addressing this to? To them and to you? Who is the you?
That's an excellent question.
And you appears in every one of the stanzas, not stanzas, but you just say
Paragraphs. So that's,
paragraphs.
You
It's
as
not
the
a capital
reader?
Y.
it could be the reader.
Who is you?
Well, here's my question back at you, is in the Kaddish, when it says unto them and unto you, who's the you? Like when we say Kaddish, who's the you?
I'm looking for the you here. Is there upon the rabbis, upon disciples? upon
Third line. In every place, unto them and unto you
Oh,
be
unto
abundant
you.
peace.
Okay, it does have it. I
Yeah,
overlooked it.
so, right, so I mean, one thing that I like about this poem actually is that like the next time you're in shul or you're davening and you hear the Kaddish, you're gonna think about the words a little bit more, right? But it did draw my attention to that too. Are we saying you in the Kaddish? Well, yeah, we are. To whom, right? And I think it's a great question.
And?
Well, I don't have the answer. Do you have the answer? When we say Kaddish, who are we talking to? And we're saying to God, you should have peace and sustenance?
Praise be your name.
Right, sure. But what about this? Unto them and unto you be abundant peace, grace, loving kindness. That doesn't feel like God. We're not wishing those things for God. Just each of you around us? Like, is this about communal, right? I mean, like a feeling for one another? Oh, good. Pulling out the siddur. Here we go. Let's see if that's got an answer. Yeah, so so I think it's invoking the language from that prayer itself, and then raising for us the question: who is the you here? And maybe when we say upon Israel to you, we really mean each of you in the room, everyone.
What is it in the Hebrew? What in the which is the sentence?
So we're going to leave that one as an open-ended question that has actually as much to do with tefillah as it does with this poem. And think about that, really, because actually the Kaddish is sort of a complicated thing that we're saying. You know it sort of as a young person as this prayer of mourning, the mourner's Kaddish, right? But even when you read that, you think, it doesn't feel like so much like a prayer of mourning. Right? And so then And so it raises some interesting questions about what we're saying that he sort of invokes here but doesn't answer for us. Yeah. All right, so let's do one more. I don't know if we can get church going done in 15 minutes or 10, but we're going to try. Okay, so as I mentioned last time, Philip Larkin, my favorite poet. I wrote a book about him. I'm a big fan. He was raised in the Christian tradition but considered himself an atheist. Lived through the 20th century, died in the early 1980s. So, bless you. So, I think what we should do with this one is instead of my reading the whole thing first. I want to go one stanza at a time and just see if we can figure out what's going on in each stanza. It's 20th century language, so it's not too hard. But one thing I want to just say at the outset for us to notice, and I wouldn't do this if we had a half hour to talk about it, but I'll set us up a little bit since we don't have so much time, is how this speaker, whom I argue is not Larkin himself, right, but a created speaker, how he changes in some way over the course of the poem, theologically in particular, right, religiously. Okay, church going. Once I am sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats, and stone, and little books, sprawlings of flowers cut for Sunday, brownish now, some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small, neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence, brewed God knows how long. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. Okay, he's a funny guy, this Larkin. All right, so, well, what's the setup? This is a narrative poem, okay, so it's telling us a story. So what's the story?
This is somebody who it seems has been cycling somewhere, probably in a rural area.
Yep, good.
Wanders into a church.
A small,
Excellent.
a
That's
small
exactly it.
church, you know, probably
Right.
not used much anymore.
Right,
really.
good.
Make sure it's empty before he goes in.
Make sure it's empty before he goes
Yes,
in, that's
yes.
right. So he's not there for prayer. Why is he there? If he's cycling and he sees a little church, why does he go in?
Curiosity.
Yeah, it seems like something like that. Let's check out what's going on here as long as no one's here to see me, right? So it's been used because there are flowers that are brownish now, which means probably last Sunday or the Sunday before, right? He says, cut for Sunday, so now maybe it's Thursday, right? And the flowers are a little worse for wear, but it's not a completely abandoned church because the flowers wouldn't just be brownish if they'd been cut, 3 years ago.
But it is
What-
musty.
Musty, exactly. But, older buildings can be, and if it's not much used, it's got that kind of mustiness and an unignorable silence. And what's our sense of this guy in piety?
He's done this before, this is another church.
Good.
So he's been church.
Another church. So he's been haunting these abandoned or empty churches, right? And how does he feel about church? Any sense at all yet? We might have to just hold on to that question for another stanza.
He
But
doesn't feel much because he said unignorable silence. It doesn't resonate to him.
He takes off.
He doesn't hear anything, doesn't.
no, unignorable is the other, right? You can't ignore it.
Right,
Oh, okay.
but that means he's not getting any feel for it.
Oh.
It just,
I don't know if
it's
that's what that
the
means.
silence.
I don't know if that's what that means.
Because he says awkward reverence.
Right,
Yes,
exactly.
A little bit of reverence.
Right.
Silence may be the place in which you find what you're looking for.
Right.
Oh,
It
rather
can't be
than-
complete irreverence because he takes off his cycle clips in awkward reverence, which
Because he
is a
doesn't have-
fantastic image because what should you do when you enter a church?
You take off your
Take off your hat. But he can't because he's not wearing a hat, so instead he takes off his cycle clips. You all know what cycle clips are, right? My students never know what cycle clips are. No,
I think
they're
they're
not.
supposed to
They're
be-
these things that you clip on your trousers so they don't get stuck in the gears. Yeah.
Oh, I thought they were the
Yeah.
clips that you.
Yeah, no, because you wouldn't wear those when you walk away from the bike usually. Although I guess
No, no, those
serious
are-
bike
those are
riders
attached
do.
to what you're talking
Yeah.
about are attached to the shoes.
Those. There are also ones on pedals. It depends what kind of bike, but yeah, cycle clips are holding your trousers so they don't get all the grease from the gear. So he pulls off these cycle clips from his trousers. Also, what do you think about brass and stuff up at the holy end? How's that sound in terms of a Christian speaker?
A little dismissive.
Little bit, right? Brass and stuff? Not great. And up at the holy end also it has a slight sense of irreverence, right? So people usually read this as irreverent, and even the awkward reverence of taking off the cycle clips, it's like, it's a nice effort, but questionable. Okay, good.
What I was going to say, I found it interesting why he seems such an easygoing guy coming in and take off his hat. The stanza itself is iambic pentameter.
That's right.
So it's very structured. And also the rhyme scheme.
And it rhymes, that's
And it
right.
rhymes,
Good.
the A, B, A, B, C, D, D, and so forth. So I found that.
Excellent observation. When you hear it read, you don't really hear it.
And I would
Yeah.
say then it gives you some inkling
Yeah.
that he's not as easygoing as he seems to be. He's kind
Excellent.
of closed in by
Great
that.
reading of form. Absolutely. Good. Okay, next one. Move forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new. Cleaned or restored? Someone would know. I don't. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce, "Here endeth," much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for. Right? Irish sixpence is worth nothing, essentially. It's like saying I put in an expired Subway token. Okay, you just have to know that context. Also, by the way, I forgot to mention in the last stanza, brood God knows how long. Fantastic line, right? Because it has that double meaning of when we say like God knows how, it means like we mean who knows, but also in this case we're talking about a church. So actually God does know how long. Right? So it's a little bit of a double meaning there. But here, what are we getting in the second stanza? More or less irreverent than the first?
Oh, definitely more.
More, right? It feels even a little more disrespectful here to stand in the place where the rector or the vicar stands and read a verse. And what's the verse he chooses?
One that is hectoring, that's putting us down.
Well, here endeth, right? Here endeth is the verse, and then you hear it echo back from the empty room. So it's suggesting something about the uselessness, in a way, of churches, or that they're past their prime.
But first he approached.
That's right.
He went to those things in the front, so something's pulling him still.
Yes, so again, I think we're in the week of ambivalence, and I think we see that here too. And he's, also speculating sort of on the building, is the roof cleaned or restored? Like, just sort of this kind of curiosity about it, noticing things, right? But then ultimately reflecting the place was not worth stopping for. Now, yet stop I did. In fact, I often do, and always end much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for, wondering too, when churches will fall completely out of use, what we shall turn them into. If we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment, plate, and pyx in locked cases, and let the rest rent free to rain and sheep, shall we avoid them as unlucky places?
This is an age of empty churches. We hear this a lot in the discourse, in the public discourse,
and shuls.
Having just been in Italy, you're visiting churches as museums.
Right.
You're looking at them as
Well, so that's what he's asking. Should we keep some around to be museums, chronically on show? Although chronically also has a sense of illness, right? And so it's an interesting choice of word as opposed to perpetually on show, right? Absolutely.
Has the use of churches changed?
Right.
Do
Absolutely.
we view them socially, religiously?
Right. But how's he feeling about them? Because he doesn't say if, he says when. When churches fall completely out of use. It's a foregone conclusion for this speaker. It's not will they, it's, when they're useless, when they've gone completely useless, then what are we going to do? Are we going to keep some around as museums, or are we just going to let the sheep wander through them?
We'll turn them into condos.
Right, he doesn't list that as a possibility, but it seems like he could say that here. Yes?
I wonder why he even went into a church.
It's a great question. This seems like someone who's not really into churches, right? In fact, I often do. And then always find myself much at a loss like this. It's a really odd thing to keep doing, right?
But he is into churches because he does keep going back.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's why we're seeing that there's some kind of pull here.
Yes, there is.
Right. Okay. So he's listed two possibilities. Oh, by the way, I just want to point out, in the first stanza, brass and stuff suggests what level of knowledge about the sort of the pomp and circumstance of the church.
Almost zero, but then he's talking about
Awesome.
parchment,
Plate
and
pyx.
Well,
That's some pretty specific stuff. Pyx is the little container, well, it doesn't always have to be little, but it's used to carry what's left of the communion wafer after communion's over, in case it needs to be taken somewhere else. So that's pretty specific, and you have some knowledge. Like, this is not a guy who's actually a brass and stuff kind of level of knowledge to say parchment, plate, and pyx. And I would say that that's completely intentional. Larkin's asking us to notice these little details about this character so that we can have some sense of, is the brass and stuff a put on, right? When he says that, to sort of show his distance from the church. But actually, there's some knowledge there. So keep that in mind. So here's some more possibilities. Or, after dark, will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone, pick simples for a cancer, or on some advised night see walking a dead one. Power of some sort will go on in games, in riddles, seemingly at random. But superstition, like belief, must die. And what remains when disbelief has gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky, a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it once was, One of the crew that tap and jot and know what rude lofts were, some ruin bibber randy for antique, or Christmas addict counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh. Let's stop there for a second because the next line goes into the next stanza. So I just read 2, but basically what have we got going on here? I would encourage you, by the way, when you have more time to read this through again because there's a lot happening, but what have we got here generally? What are the other possibilities now that he's listed for us of what's going to happen to the church?
Superstition, a place of superstition.
Exactly. It's going to become a place of superstition. Dubious women, right, skeptical, are going to come to make their children touch a particular stone. What's the sense of that? Does that remind you of anything? Like the Blarney stone, exactly. Like a kind of like good luck, we don't really know why sort of charm thing. What's simples for a Cancer? Does anyone know what that is? That's just antiquated language. It's like what?
Well, so simple would be a concoction made from herbs.
Excellent, great, yeah, not everybody knows that, so good, yes. So to pick herbs to treat some illness, right? Or on some advised night, see walking a dead one, right? To come here to look for ghosts. Now, of course, you know that a church is usually next to a churchyard, which is a burying place, so that there's more reason to think ghost here than when we think about other religious traditions. And then he sort of has this philosophical statement, power of some sort will go on, right? There's going to be some powers of some kind, but it could just be superstition. It's like games, riddles. Superstition, like belief, must die, and what remains when disbelief has gone, right? So he's already in his mind on the road to disbelief, but then what's next when there's no disbelief? And then he starts listing the pieces of the church that are going to fall into ruin, the physical pieces, right? A shape less recognizable each week. And then we see again, like you were pointing out with the parchment plate and picks, that he has a lot of knowledge, right? Who's going to come next, right? One of the crew that tap and jot, what does that mean? Yeah, people taking notes, right? Like someone who's just interested in the architecture or the history and know what rood lofts were. But you can't say, oh, some crazy person who knows what rood lofts were when you come up with the term rood lofts yourself, right? So he has some knowledge here. And then says another possibility is just antiques collectors, right? They're going to come by. Or people who love Christmas, hoping to have like a little smell of what Christmas used to be, right? And then here's the last choice. Or will he be my representative, bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub, because it held unspilt so long and equably what since is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death and thoughts of these, for which was built this special shell. For though I've no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. And that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which, he once heard, was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. Oh, it's so amazing. I love it.
Such a tender soul.
I know, he does. And then it's so interesting because when you read the scholarship on this poem, everyone says, like, see, he hated religion. I'm like, what? Did you even read the last stanza? But he's not attaching himself to religion in a very conventional way, right? Still, though, to say there's something there. Right? And so this person who starts and says, I don't know what I'm doing here. Why do I keep stopping these churches? Every time I say it's a waste of my time. Ends with something quite different, right? A serious house on serious earth it is. And ultimately saying, can't quite explain it. Can't exactly tell you why, but there's something, right? And people are going to keep coming to this spot. And even when the church is gone, even when it's been let to rain and sheep, something here because, right? There's a hunger in himself to be more serious, and he heard this place was proper to grow wise in, which I think does connect us in some level back to the Tennyson, that desire to be wise, to know what we should know, to know some tiny bit of what God knows, right? And the frustration we feel at not knowing it, and that like wish for it, and the wish to not wish for it, and like all of those emotions sort of mixed up together that I think we all live with all the time. These poems, for me, give us a moment to stop and actually articulate that tension for ourselves, feel it for a moment and maybe enrich our lives a little bit by living with it a little more consciously. Thank you. To be continued next week. There's even more, so much more. I hope you guys like that, but thanks all for your great comments today too. This was really fun.